Alright, we are live now. Alright, hello everybody and welcome to Advanced Cameras. Sorry I'm a couple minutes late, was helping out a fellow student right now, just going through some camera settings. But welcome in. Let me get everybody started. Today we are going to be doing advanced photography. As always, to anybody watching at home, guys can just chat or comment in if you have any comments or questions while we're teaching. For anybody in class, if you have any questions as we're going through the presentation, feel free to stop me and ask. But without any further ado, let's get started. So the first thing I start with when it comes to the advanced photography is the difference between JPEG and RAW. At this point in photography, we're past the point of learning the basic settings on the camera. We're past the point of learning more about lenses and photo methods and maybe more about the exposure triangles, so things like aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, how they come together and how they're separate. Now we're getting into more of the nitty-gritty parts of what do we do after we take our photos. And a lot of what we do after our photos is we edit. So the first slide, we talk about the difference between a JPEG and a RAW file. And I got this little image to kind of spell all of that out. A regular RAW file is going to look diminished in photo quality. It'll look a little bit burnt out. It'll look more pale, if you will. But the whole point of then a RAW is that it's a non-compressed file. So it's a larger file that has a larger color gambit to it. And we're able to then edit and change a lot more of that photo than a standard JPEG. So a RAW right out of the camera won't look finished. It won't look complete. A JPEG, on the other hand, will look pretty complete and finished, but there might be certain qualities of the JPEG that we don't like, that we want to change. And that's where we can always edit a JPEG, but we get a lot more out of editing a RAW than we do a JPEG. The photo on the right, we then have a process RAW. And you can see the difference between the process RAW and the JPEG. The areas I always like to look at, if you look at the guitar itself, it has more shine to it. The color comes out a little bit more. His guitar strap coming around the shoulder, that leather looks a little bit more brighter. And then same thing with the wrinkles in the black of his shirt. It just is more defined, has more substance to it. We can see the wrinkles clearly. Areas like his skin on his arm, the way that shadow's hitting, it's a little bit more detailed. The freckles on his arm pop out too. So it's those little things that when we edit a RAW photo, we can pull those forward more and bring that more to attention. Comparing the two next to each other in a chart form, a JPEG is a compressed file, whereas a RAW is a uncompressed file. And really what that comes down to is its color and file size. So again, for a compressed file, you're looking at a 2 to 6 megabytes file size, depending on the camera that you're shooting on. If you're using your standard 24 or 20 megapixel camera, that's roughly what you're looking at. If you're shooting with something higher, like a 30, 40, or a 60 megapixel camera, imagine these numbers 3 to 4 times more than what you're looking at here. When we look at a RAW file, it's a larger size. It's almost double, it is double, what our standard JPEG is going to be. So if, depending on the camera you're shooting on, if you notice that it is 30 megabytes for a JPEG, well then it's most likely going to be 2 times that number, so it's more 60 or 70 megabytes a photo if you're doing RAW. Where the editing really comes into play is that with a JPEG, you only have 8-bit color ratio, so it's not a lot that you can change or edit on the photo. But when we move over to a RAW, we have a higher color bit, and that's 12 to 16. So when you're playing with those dials and knobs and you're adjusting brightness, saturation, hue, you're going to have a much greater effect editing on a RAW photo than you will a JPEG photo. Now, with JPEG, it has the ability to be edited on any photo editor. Now, with RAW, they can be edited as a RAW on some editing softwares, but most likely, depending on the quality of editor you're using, they have to be converted into another file. All that means is that if you have a MacBook or a Windows computer at home, you already have a free photo editor built into the computer. So you don't need to spend any money and do any of that stuff. But when you're using those programs, you're most likely going to be limited to just a JPEG. It's not going to give you the ability to edit a RAW photo. And that's where we'll talk about next other editing softwares that you can look into and the ones that I recommend. From there, though, the JPEG can be transferred faster, and that's the last little bit on there. So, again, For the last classes that we've taught and talked about, if you are a beginner photographer and you're not as concerned about getting an image edited or changed up or really anything crazy done to it, a JPEG is going to be more than enough. But if you've been shooting for years, you're happy with the photos the way they are, but you're wondering what the next step is, I would definitely encourage you to try the RAW format out there. Either use the free editors that are available or pay for another editor to then see if you like that kind of thing. So we covered how to make the camera take a picture, but what do we do after with that picture? And that's the question for the class. We edit our photos. It's the final step before framing or sending them out to clients, or just before you put them in your computer and probably never look at them for a few years. It's the next step in the process of photos. So I mentioned earlier, things that I would recommend as far as editing software is concerned. Adobe is one of the best ones out there. At the current moment with how they use their editor softwares, they basically ask you to pay monthly for those services. But Photoshop and Lightroom are the two most popular. Now, Photoshop, as I tell most people, is more of a hardcore editor. What you can do with that is, if let's say that you took a picture of a beautiful park, but there was this one dog peeing on a bush, and you wanted to get rid of that dog, you have a much easier time getting rid of it in Photoshop than you do Lightroom. It's built in Photoshop to change or edit. That's where that expression of photoshopping or changing images comes from, because of what you can do with Photoshop. If you're interested in just mainly playing with the color, the lighting, the exposure, burning and dodging elements, then Lightroom is probably going to be more of your forte. From there, they also have Capture One Pro and Corel Paint Shop Pro. Both are very similar to Photoshop with the similar attributes to Lightroom. Photoshop has very similar attributes to Lightroom in it too, but Lightroom is designed, again, more for the color, the light. Capture One Pro, Corel Paint Shop Pro, both offer very similar features on there. It's a one-time payment that you make instead of paying monthly for the product. And they really do offer a lot of nice tools on there to change your photos. As far as we go now with editing your photos, what we're really mainly looking at are the common themes or the main steps that any photographer will take when they're editing their photos. And then from there, depending on what software you're using, you can then make changes or how will you say, more different tools that you can use based on the software that you're using. So examples for why we edit photos. A lot of people will complain, we'll start with the top right image, a lot of people will complain about darkness or overshadowing on their images. They're able to use tools on their editor softwares to work on exposure, to work on the color, the saturation, the hue, the reflection of water. So that's a really nice feature there. We look at the bottom row. A is probably the first photo that they took of the girl. Then from there you have B, a little bit more light. And then you get to C, where her hair stands out a little bit more. The blue of her sweater is more apparent. There's a little blemish on the chin. That's removed in number C there. But again, it doesn't affect her overall look. It doesn't look cheesy. It doesn't look like someone went in with a paintbrush and changed something. So there's really nice ways to use these without really editing or changing your photos too much. Same thing goes with the baby photo. We have the newborn as it came out, and then we have the professional edit. With the newborn, you can see the wrinkles on the forehead, the darkness that naturally comes in because of the way that this baby's positioned. And in the edit, you're able to see the more softness of the skin, the harsh shadow on the forehead is reduced, the eyes are made to be a little bit smoother. That's more of a severe edit where they're really changing the integrity of the photo. But by doing that, they're probably offering a better product to their customer or to themselves, however you will. And then same thing on the top left. Just by a couple changes in color and saturation, we're able to make the purple of his sweater more vibrant. We're able to make his face lighten up a little bit more so we can see more of the wrinkles and everything else on him. As well as the little girl too in her blue, we can see how that stands out a lot more. So editing our photos might seem like a task or might seem like another step that you have to add in this process, but it can really help change a good photo into a great photo just with a couple different things. So the first thing that I always recommend when we're editing photos is that we crop and clean our image. So start by straightening the alignment of your photo. After that, go through and make sure that you do not have any excess negative or dead space. spot cleaning should occur at this time. So a lot of the times when I tell people with the shooting, I tell them to shoot the entirety of the image, because you can always go back in and crop and change things that you don't want. So the image on the left, you have the girl kayaking here on some beautiful water. Instead of getting all of the scenery around her, which is mainly just sky and a lot of blue, this person cropped in on the photo. They moved them more to the third of the page, which again goes back to our rule of thirds from the first class. And then we're able to see more of things in the distance and not have so much blue sky. Our main subject is the girl with her paddles. So again, cropping the image to get rid of negative space, things that aren't helping our image to be the best it can be. From there then, we want to spot clean. Now the reason we look at spot cleaning is that we sometimes get marks or harsh areas on our photo. That can be from damaged sensors, that can be from a light leak, that can also be from just having debris on the physical lens. So in that case, Photoshop, Adobe, even your free editors usually have a spot cleaning tool where you're able to select another portion of the photo that is clean and then basically cover up those bad spots or those marks on the page. And that's the first step before we get into any color changing or anything else, because we can see the photo's full integrity before we start changing things up. The next thing that I like to do is to adjust my white balance. So white balance doesn't refer to exposure. That's an important thing to remember because we'll talk about exposure later. Rather, it refers to the color of your overall composition. You will have less to play with when shooting in JPEG versus RAW, and some editors will have presets you can control and change. Others will have temperature and tint, and some will have both. So again, this is where the whole JPEG versus RAW debate comes up. If you're shooting in JPEG, you're going to be limited to that 8-bit color gambit that you have. So changing things with white balance might be very stark, might have big changes by just moving a little bit, so it can be a little tough. However, if we're shooting on RAW, we should have more access to the full color spectrum because that's a 32-bit color. So moving our dial just a little bit in one direction or the other when we're editing it shouldn't have as drastic of a change as the JPEG does. Now when we look at presets, some of these companies that have editors are not going to let you just use a dial, and the dial usually is temperature and tint. A lot of these guys, what they'll do is they'll have different presets on there. So a fluorescent preset, similar if you walk into Target right now with all the Christmas lights. There's bulbs that hurt people's eyes. Those are typically fluorescent bulbs. Tungsten has more of a blue tone to it. Flash is going to lighten things up but not be too far off of what the original picture would be. Cloudy brings in a little bit more of this natural color spectrum, trying not to make it look like it's been washed out, but add a little bit more vibrancy. Shade, same thing, it's going to start making things a little bit more yellow or brighter in certain areas, making darks peak a little bit more. And then daylight, which is really going to cut out most of what we're seeing as far as color is concerned. You get more of a neutral picture. Now, those are some examples of what you're going to see as presets. However, for most editors and for most other programs, you're going to get a little bar that talks about temperature and tint. It's the CMYK color spectrum. So in this case, we have cyan over there, we have our magenta over there, green, and then it technically is purple or indigo, but there's another term for it that gives it the K, so the CMYK. Or orange would also be yellow. So yeah, cyan, yellow, green, and then the K, I always forget exactly what the K stands for, but it refers to indigo or pink, if you will. Those are going to be basically the same thing as the presets here. The only difference is that instead of you being able to just pick the preset that you want based on the editor, you're able to physically move the dial in any direction to see. And one of the things that I tell people with these is that if you are brand new to this and you've never done it, it might seem silly or foolish, but take the dial and go all the way one way and go all the way the other way. You're not really going to know exactly what these things do until you really get to see the difference. If you bump it up one way or the other, a point or 2 points, it might make a very small difference, and you might be wondering why that matters. So take it, go all the way to one side, all the way to the other, and really pay attention to what's being affected in the photo when you do that. So the next thing is exposure and contrast. So when we were talking earlier about our white balance, it doesn't refer to the exposure. And that's important to remember as we talk about exposure here, because exposure plays on the brightness and the darkness of the photo. Not just parts of the photo, but the entirety of the photo. So beware of making a photo too bright because you can get a muted or muddled look to your photo, but beware of making it too dark because then you're going to lose a lot of the contrast and you'll basically lose the whole image because it'll be consumed within the darkness. Contrast plays with dark and light tones. High contrast makes the image stark with very dark or very light sections. Low contrast will make things look flat and washed out. The goal is to aim for the middle. So again, when you're putting these photos into an editor, most of them are going to start in the middle of whatever the dial is. So if you could go one way or the other, typically it'll be right in the center for all of these. And as you change, then you can kind of go from there. So with exposure, we're playing with the brightness and the darkness of the entire image. And I use this image right on the right side of the screen to illustrate that. Your normal one in the center there, you have your underexposed on the right, on the left, and then on the right you have your overexposed. You can see that with the normal camera, things look right. The color looks perfect. It doesn't look like it's off. It doesn't look like there is something missing to it. It's clearly a walk path going either into condos or into a maybe residential area or maybe a business. You got trees along the way and then some other things adorning the grass. When we look at the overexposed though, we start to lose a lot. The sky starts to become washed out and white. From there too, we start to lose the road a little bit more. That becomes a little bit more washed out. Excuse me. Didn't have a coffee today. Underexposed image, we're seeing a lot more darkness to it. It looks like there's no sunlight. It's dark. We're losing a lot of the building's details. We're losing the tree's color and definition. So again, underexposing or overexposing will cause an image to look somewhat like this. Unless that's what you're going for as your goal, you probably want to aim for something closer to the middle, or changing things in one way or the other in just small incremental bits. Contrast though is going to take everything that exposure does, but limit it to the dark and the light tones. So when we look at an image, we're going to see things that are basically middle ground, dark tone, and light tone. And I have another thing we'll talk about, which is a histogram, which plays into this as well too. When we look at the before images for both the mountain and this beach area, we can see that they either look a little dark or they look as if they don't have enough going on. There's just sharpness or something that's missing. When we look at the after images, we can see how much more light is created on there. We can see more definition. And the way that I look at, especially the mountain tops there in France on the left side, is that it's more dramatic. It has more of a cinematic effect. You've made the clouds darker, you've made the mountain tops darker as well too, but you've really added dark highlights into the mountains so you can see the different areas and where things are splitting. Also the light that's breaking through the mountaintop, you can see how much more light is hitting there. And on top of that, how much more bright that light looks. When we look at then the image next to it, we can see the the rock formations next to the water. We can still see the nice darkness underneath the rocks where the waves are hitting or splashing, but we can see the colors of the rocks much more easily. On top of that too, the definition of the rocks as well, where the bright or the dark tones are, they become more apparent because they're not so washed out or muddled with what we had on the left side there. So again, what we're aiming for in this is to boost contrast, which is, I would say, our dramaticism in our photo. And then exposure, which is going to be how much, I would say, how much the photo is exposed to the light at hand. It's not like the day of film where you could overexpose an image and it would become completely washed out, or you could underexpose an image and it would be dark. In the world of digital, while those rules still apply, we as an artist or as a photographer have the ability to manipulate that at any time that we want. Same idea with ISO. In the back of the day when you shot with a film camera, whatever that film canister was, that was what your exposure or your ISO was. Nowadays, we have the ability to go through and change the ISO to be whatever we want it to be to help take the best photo possible. This is a histogram, so as I was saying earlier, I use dark tones, light tones, but we can consider it in 3 different categories: shadows, midtones, and highlights. Now, this would be considered a pretty even histogram. The reason being is that we don't want our highlights to overpower our image. We don't want everything to be very bright. So highlights are typically low. Midtones being the fact that most of our image should be made up of midtones. They are measuring luminosity, and from there, that should be probably the highest one, because if we're taking a photo of a whole room, midtones versus highlights and darks should definitely be greater. And then we have shadows, which shadows are greater than highlights in certain situations. But again, it shows that differential in how things are broken up with the light. So a histogram isn't always needed when editing photos, but a histogram is a great way to see how your light is distributed throughout the image. So again, we have a properly exposed image on the center here on my left chart. That way we can see the darkness of the clouds coming in, the waves, we can see the sand, the building, everything looks clear. When we overexpose it, we take the majority of the dark and move it, or midtones, and move it all the way to the right side, which it starts to look washed out. We're losing that balance between the sky and the building. It doesn't look like it's there anymore. The beach is also turning more white, and then on top of that too, the building doesn't have as much shadow or characteristic. When we look at underexposed on the other side though, it's much darker. Things start to get lost in the background and foreground relationship. We have maybe a little bit more dramaticism going on with the image, but our histogram is all shifted to the left. Now, where I think histograms are great, I also think that they are not the most important, because at the end of the day, it's the photo that you took yourself that is going to look the best. And if you think that the photo looks good, then I would go with your gut instinct on that one. You can always edit and change things, but when we look at something like the ones on the right side here, these are 4 images that don't have traditional histograms. They have their own lineup, but they look nice. So for example, the one on the left here of our foresty area with trees everywhere, and a nice blue sky, that one's saying there are a lot of high tones or highlights, a lot of mid-tones, and we have a drop-off in dark tones. And that's not hard to believe. When we look at this image, we can see that there are not a lot of dark places around the image. But on the flip side of that, there are a lot of mid-tones or middle ground for this photo. And when we look at the light, well, we have a beautiful white or beautiful blue sky, clouds that are going to be a nice whiteness to it too. And because the clouds are spanning all the way back in the background, the histogram, our photo, is able to give us this chart. If we look down at the one on the below that, we have something that's completely dark, but we have this nice eerie fog that's cutting through by this, and it looks maybe menacing, or it adds character to whatever it is that we're trying to do. But again, it's not a perfectly even histogram. Same thing on the left side here, or on the top right. We have mainly in the dark, and we have a little bit of light coming from the grass below it, but the majority of this whole image is the trees, is the line that they're in, and how dark that looks when they're all clumped together. And then lastly, we have our dandelion down below. And the dandelion being the fact that it's very bright and light color, mixed with the fact that we're taking a photo, it's going to give us a much higher highlight reading. So that's an example of 4 images that are breaking the standard of a histogram. A lot of people like it, especially if you're more of a professional photographer and you're doing maybe high school portraits, or you're shooting for a friend's video, or maybe some sort of publication. Then looking at those are important, because you want to make sure that it'll look good when it gets printed. But in the case of what we're doing here, if the image is for you, you're putting it on a computer, you're doing something afterwards, the histogram itself shouldn't worry you. The next thing we're going to look at is vibrancy and saturation. Now, vibrancy will increase or decrease the color intensity in brighter colors throughout your images. And saturation will increase or decrease color throughout the entire image evenly. Both are important though. So when we look at something like the vibrancy, I use the dog on the right side to illustrate that. The original is in the center there. The tongue looks like bubblegum. The brown of the fur has lighter blonde spots to it, and his eyes or her eyes have this really nice cream, or not cream, but like amber color to them. However, now if we underexpose it by 100 points, we're losing all of that extra color that the dog has, and we're losing that color on the tongue, but the eyes remain the same for the most part. And when we look at vibrancy plus 100, we can see how bright the image looks. The tongue is bright pink, the fur has a little bit more brown orangey tones to it, even the grass and the greenery behind it is brighter as well too. So that vibrancy, again, will take the entirety of your image and increase that intensity on there. Or sorry, the brighter colors, I should say. So things that we can look at that don't have any would be the sidewalk here. The sidewalk will slightly change color as you're going, but for the most part, it's going to stay uninterrupted. Now, if you need to change that, that's where saturation comes in, and I use the bottom left image to illustrate that. For saturation, we take a before photo of this farm town or area, and if we then change the physical saturation on there, we can bring out a lot more of the bright colors. So again, you look at a cloud shot like that, and you can see, purples, blues, reds, oranges, but when you really get to then increase the saturation on there, you can really see the reds, the blues, the purples, the yellows, the oranges, a more full array of colors. And not only that, but when we look at then our sprawling mountains in this countryside area, we can see the greenery, the grass, everything else just brighter, more vibrant. And then one of the last things that we do in our photo editing process is we are going to then adjust the sharpness on there. So it's one of the last things you do after you edit the other parts of your image. Sharpness will bring out definition and depth of field within your images. Too much, though, will create this halo effect around the image. And I've been working to get a better halo image on here, but when we look at our foxes, we can see that the fox on the left is the before, and then our fox on the right is the after. Certain areas of the fox got brighter, parts of the fur stand out a little bit more, the color on the cheek stands out a little bit more, but one of the big kickers on this one is that because we raised the sharpness up so much, there is a small but invisible halo that wraps around this whole thing. And if you notice it, most likely the people you're taking photos will also notice it. Now, when we look at the frogs on the right side, we can see that frog on the right is going to be sharpened, and the frog on the left is not. And where you really can see that detail is just by looking at the frog's face itself. The highlights pop more, the eyes pop more, areas on the frog's mouth or the lip area show a lot more color or variation with that. And then on top of that too, you have the little arm that's sticking out there, and while it looks just fine on the other one, on this one you could really see the detail inside the frog's nails or toes or whatever those guys are. Once we're done editing our photos, which again, for some people it can take multiple hours to get one photo done, for others it can take them 30 seconds to get just a couple changes that they need done. Everyone's different. The next thing I would recommend is to print or display your images. Depending on what you're doing, these photos over here are for print, and these photos would be for the digital frame on the right side there. When we look at the chart, these are the most common photo sizes that you'll see. So 4x6, 5x11, 6x8, 5x10, 8x10, and 10x12. If you're shooting on a crop sensor camera, those frame sizes should be more than enough for you. It's not a problem. You can blow it up. You can make it bigger. I have a 61 megapixel camera at home. I would really want to print a 36 by 36 foot print, but at the same time, I'm like, I'll get there when I get there. In this case though, you have a 24, 16 to 20, 12 to 15, and 11 by 14. Those are going to be your larger prints, and not saying that you can't print them with a crop sensor camera, but it's probably going to be in your best interest is to use a full frame. The reason being is that a full frame can expand bigger. It can also be cropped in more, which will help adjust any of the various things that we've talked about in the class today, but it will also it'll also help you then take these photos to the next place. So full frame, you can get away with the bottom row there. They're bigger prints, bigger sizes, you can blow up to that. Crop sensor camera, I definitely would recommend staying on that first row, just so that way you're ensuring that the image quality of whatever it is you took is maintained and stays the same way. So we break down a little bit about videography in this class as well too, getting into more of the advanced settings on there. When it comes to photography, we have a lot of people nowadays who are getting ready to start YouTube channels. They're their own business owners, so they do all their own content creation for that. And we have a lot of young people who are going into marketing or just into ways of generating views, sales, or content in general. And so that's where videography really plays a part on showing off products, showing off rising actors or comedy, just anything and all things that can revolve around you recording. Videography comes into that. So within filming videos or content, you're going to work in these three phases. These are the main three phases that you go through when you make a product or a production. So pre-production are the initial steps to begin making your project. I usually like to classify this as I'm going to sit in Starbucks and work on my computer until I figured out every little detail of what I need. Maybe where I'm recording, what I'm going to be recording, what's my lighting going to look like when I record this, what's the energy or vibe that I want to go with to make sure I get the product right, how many products am I shooting, is my one camera enough, should I have another camera, how am I transferring these photos when I'm done. It's those little things that get thought about in the pre-production that then help your production, the main phase of capturing clips or film to use. It'll make your main production a lot faster because you've really tightened everything up. You know exactly what you're doing with pre-production. So production just goes into you actually getting the thing done. And then from there you have post-production, which is putting it all together to make that final piece. I would say post-production probably will take one of the longest besides production. But post-production, if you're diligent with it, should give you that final result that you're looking for. So post-production would be any of the editing that we just talked about. Post-production would then be putting the video together, cropping things out, adding music, maybe adding some effects, all that sort of thing is what post-production is going to give you. When we look at video and resolution, there's three things to look at when we look at video. Resolution, ratio, and frames a second. If anybody has bought a TV here in the last few years, standard definition, for the most part, has gone away. HD is now the king to everything that's 1080 megapixels, or sorry, 1080 HD or 1080 megapixels. And all that basically means is that depending on the size of your TV, they take an inch of that and they count how many dots are on there for the picture. How many dots are there is what then quantifies your picture quality. So if they took the number of dots going downwards and the number of dots going across, and then they divided it by the number going diagonally, that's where you're going to get exactly what the resolution quality of your TV is. So 720 is standard HD, 1080 is HD, 4K is 4,000 dots a circle, 8K is 8,000 dots in a square or circle. So again, the higher quality you go, the more you can do with that video as far as either editing or blowing it up to make it bigger, such as you see in the corner on the right side there. Playing with that will change what your resolution of your video will look like, and it'll give you a higher quality video or a lesser quality video. It's important to remember that when using cameras, depending on how you're recording, things like standard definition and HD won't take up a lot of your battery life. But if you're using 4K, 8K, it's going to eat the battery up a lot faster. Ratios now go into the picture's image sizing. If anybody saw the new Oppenheimer movie, that came out, they did a really cool job of playing with perspective when it came to ratio. So for a majority of the movie, they shot in, I believe, a 1-to-1 ratio, which is basically a box. 2 lines going on the side there. That would be very reminiscent of 12mm film or Super 8mm film, your old school style of filming videos back in the day. And since Oppenheimer took place in the 30s and 40s, it makes sense. Now, when they would get into these retrospective moments where he was questioning his existence and what he was doing, making the atom bomb, they then changed the ratio to give it more of a 16:9. So they basically expanded outward and then lowered it down. And that was a trick that they had done in order to get the effect that they wanted, that he was thinking about this as he was going, and it wasn't all just cookie cutter for, what have you. I won't ruin the movie too much. But they used ratios in order to do or get that effect out of their viewer. So depending on what you're trying to do, if you're making a video for Instagram, you probably don't want to do a 4:3 or 3:2 or 16:9. A 1:1 is probably what you're going to want to do because you're making a video for a square box. If you're shooting for, let's say, TikTok or other phone apps that require video, you probably would take a 4:3 and then flip it so that way it's vertical, so that way it would take up the entirety of someone's phone screen. And then the other ones, depending on what format or what you're trying to do, a 3:2 or a 16:9 might also work too. But all an aspect ratio is doing is changing the viewing angle that we're going to be seeing it at. And how do we then cut things in or crop things in or change our photo or our video up. Last thing we have is frames per second. So frames per second, that is the way that we are showing the video. For anyone who didn't know, video is basically a stack of photos that then is removed one after the other in a quick fashion. It's like if you bought a flip book or anything else and you'd sit there and curl the pages and you'd see a stick man jump up and down. That's exactly the same kind of concept with frames per second. However, it gets a little bit more complex when we think about how many we need in order to get the best video. So your standard, Hollywood standard, is 24 frames per second. If you're shooting a video, 24 frames a second is more than enough to get the video down, no jumpy, no lagginess, it looks clean. A lot of companies now will also do 60 frames a second, which will utilize more battery, more memory when they're filming. However, though, it'll give you a very crisp video. 12 is basically not heard of. It would be very start and stop for the most part. But then the big one is 120 frames a second, which is mainly for more of your, how will I put it, slow-mo or hyperlapse videos. If you're recording or doing something and you need to get it over a duration of time, that's where then having something like 120 frames a second is better, because you can really slow down that video without ruining the quality, or speed that video up without it lagging on you or changing. So the must-haves. So when I first was starting to get ready to teach this class, I talked to our marketing and our videography team upstairs, and they told me that I have two options. I could be bad at one thing, but not all three things. So in this case, the main three parts of making video are going to be your camera quality, your lighting, and your audio quality. Having a camera for camera quality, having a camera that shoots appropriately for the content you are trying to make, doesn't have to be movie quality, but it has to work for you and your project or your page. So my best example of this, one of my good friends, he's got a clothing brand. His clothing brand is centered around Y2K, early 2000s. So when he shoots his videos, he actually uses an old Sony Handycam from 1996. It was their first digital one. It fits his mold perfectly. It gives him exactly what he needs when he's taking a video, but it doesn't necessarily mean he has the best camera, but it works for his brand, his identity. Lighting. And I can flip the page for this one because we'll talk about it on the next slide, but under the 3-point lighting method. So you have a key light, a fill light, and a backlight. And I believe the image next illustrates that. So a key light. Key light is going to come down on our subject matter and hit him from the front, or them from the front. But basically it's the beginning light to get light onto our subject matter. Now typically with a key light, while that's great and all, it's going to leave shadows, marks, and it's going to leave things that aren't as flattering. And that's where a fill light then comes in to counteract all of that other stuff. It gives us the rest of the light that we need in order to make sure that we get the most light on the subject that we're trying to do. And then we have a backlight. And a backlight is going to light up the behind section of our subject, and it's going to make sure that we then get the rest of the light filled in so we don't have any awkward backward shadows. So the reason we do this is to reduce shadows. It's to reduce anything that could basically look bad on an image. And that goes into videography as well too. We're making sure we have proper lighting is appropriate. I use this room for example that I teach in. It has recessed can lighting, and all of the lighting in here is warm tone. So it almost has more of like a fire pit or a fire bulb kind of aspect, if you will. It's a warm Kelvin. And that's great, but because the light is so recessed, we have these large pockets of areas where shadow is abundant, and there's a lot of movement within that shadow. Just looking right now, I could see my shadow on the floor, and I could see my hands and everything, so I could tell that there's a light coming from here hitting me, causing the shadow that I'm seeing. Audio quality is the next one, and it's important that we have the proper microphone for this. I would say audio quality and camera quality are two of the most important things. People can forgive you for bad lighting, but they will not watch your videos or care to see what you're doing if you have bad cameras or bad audio. So make sure that you have the appropriate camera for what you're doing. Make sure when you light things up, it doesn't even need to necessarily be as fancy as having big studio lightings, but even making sure that you buy either those little block lights or a flashlight or something where you can add light to the subject in an appropriate manner to provide equal light distribution throughout will help. And then microphones, which we'll talk about in 2 slides, I believe. So other alternative lighting to look at. So we talk about the 3-point lighting system on there. When you look at lights, there are on-camera flashes, which if you're a photographer, you're probably used to that. An on-camera flash is usually a burst or a strobe of some sort. It'll add light to the subject matter that you're trying to photograph or video. However, it really is only guaranteed for a quick pop or a use. So if you're trying to use this for a longer period of time, then you probably want to look for an on-camera LED light or light block. Those go onto the camera themselves. They're little squares or rectangles, and they'll provide ongoing light in either an RGB format or a cold and warm tone format that will then elevate or allow a little bit more extra light to hit your subject matter. And then during the pandemic, these became extremely popular for social media, but ring lights. They're still popular now. They've definitely died down more and more as people are going outside and experiencing things more. But they're very popular with people who are YouTubing or vlogging. They add a great amount of light to the subject matter. The biggest problem with these though is that when you're recording, you will usually get a light effect on your eye where your inside of your eyes have a bright white light circle on there because the camera is reflecting that off. That's my one problem with ring lights. Microphones. So automatically, if you bought a camera, unless you bought something that is 30 years old that didn't even have video, almost every camera has a microphone on there. It's an in-camera mic. If you've bought a TV in the last also 5-6 years, this is the biggest complaint I see with TVs. When you buy a TV, they put the speakers in the back of the TV. So when they fire out, they fire to the wall, and that sometimes feels muddled or disturbed. It doesn't sound right. Same thing can go with the in-camera microphone. Because the camera is inside the microphone, behind the protective coating of the camera body, sometimes our videos feel muddled and they don't feel right. And depending on the way that you grip the camera, if you're holding it with 2 hands, there's a very good chance that you'll block that out and you'll get little to no sound or it'll feel muffled. That's where then getting an on-camera microphone comes in. And you can get these little shotgun microphones. They come in, I'd say, anywhere between $60 all the way up to a couple $100 depending on the quality that you get. The higher the quality of microphone, the different decibel ratings that you can set it up for, so that way it picks up particular sound waves. But you can also get it where it's a simple microphone, plugs into the camera, and it's good to go. If you're even remotely interested in doing video, I definitely would say get an on-camera microphone. My personal favorite, though, are the wireless microphones. And I actually own this little setup right here. I use it all the time when I'm making videos or doing stuff with my friends. It's great because one connects to the camera, and the camera's picking up all of that audio recording that you're doing, but then the two transponders can go anywhere that you want and pick up that audio quality too. So it's a really nice way of not having any wires, having this nice open set that you can really do anything with. A boom microphone is something that you won't see often, but if you are someone who needs that, they are available. That's typically where you're in a space where, let's say you can't have microphones, or you might have extra microphones, but again, you want to make sure you get that audio quality perfect. You'd have someone stand there holding the microphone above someone else's head, and then from there it's picking up the sound as it's being transpired. And then lastly, a lav mic. Lav mics go hand in hand with the wireless mics. They also go into a whole different wireless transponder world, where if you ever watch the news or you watch maybe local, and news is probably the best one, or sports, all of those guys, before they go up and they sit down at their table and they start talking about the news, they all get mic'd up in the back. So they put this little black transponder box usually in either their back pocket or hooked to their belt loop of some sort. From there, they then run a cable usually up their jacket or shirt, and then they have a little black dot just hanging out on the top of their collar or dress or whatever it is. That's the microphone. So as they're talking or saying things, the microphone is picking that sound up, putting it through a transmitter, and then sending it back to whatever it needs to go. Again, more advanced. Where you'd see a lav microphone at the current moment is with any of the wireless mics. They're very popular. Stabilizing your shot. This is one of the last things we'll talk about before we get into questions for the class today. But when we're shooting video, it's important that we stabilize our shot. We don't want something rocky. We don't want something that will look like we were shaking the whole time. We want to make sure that we have a good hold on the camera in order to make sure we get a smooth, clean video. So things that we'll see in the stabilizing world, tripods. So if you're a photographer or a videographer, you've probably seen these before. Your standard monopod is a one-legged stick. Typically you'll see hikers use things like this. You'll see action sports photographers use something like this. There's a rule in the NFL where if you're shooting photos on the sideline and the guy starts running to you, you can't pick your camera up. Your camera's padded and protected. You just got to drop it and walk away. So that's where the monopod comes into play, because you can do that sort of thing and just tip it over. But you see a lot of people that go on safari, they go on hikes, they don't want to lug around a big tripod with them, so they'll bring a monopod. That usually does the trick. Moving over, we have a still photo tripod or a ball head joint tripod. The reason we call it a ball head joint is because there's a little ball on the inside there. There's a locking mechanism that swivels around in all different directions, and from there you're able to get a landscape or a portrait shot, or a landscape or a horizontal shot, horizontal or vertical shot. You're also able to angle it in all sorts of different directions. And the nice thing is that if you're taking photos and you're doing longer exposure, tripods will help make sure that it isn't shaky, or it isn't blurry when that image is finished. Then you have a video tripod. Video tripods have what you call a fluid motion head. And so from there, what that basically means is that you can roll, you can pan, and then you can also tilt slightly with that guy. Some video tripods too will even have wheels on the bottom, so if you're in an event where, let's say you're at a wedding and it has nice smooth ballroom floors, you'll see a lot of videographers walking around with a rolling tripod so that they're able to get everything that they want, and they don't have to necessarily worry about any bumps or anything else, because the camera is stabilized, they're getting the shot they need, and at any point in time they can just roll the whole thing to get where they're trying to go. If that's not what's needed, and you need something that has even more stabilization because you're going to be running and gunning, that's when the gimbals come into play. And I consider them the run and gun of the camera industry. So single hand gimbals are one-handed contraption. You hold onto it like this, the camera sits on the top there, and then from there, as you move, the camera will stabilize on the top. And I'll show you a little bit about the setup on that on the last slide. A two-handed gimbal is very similar. You're holding it with two hands. Typically there's a monitor associated with this, and someone or yourself would be looking at that monitor as you're recording to make sure that it's perfect. They would then help critique and get you in position where you need it to go. But then same idea. With the two hands on there, you can move your body in all different directions, and this shouldn't move or jingle or jump around as if you were just holding the camera and running with it. And the last product, which I don't sell in the store here, I also have only seen one person in my entire life wear it, is a body gimbal or a stabilizer vest. If, let's say, my best example, I should say, is my old roommates in college. One was working on a documentary. They had a $70,000 camera setup that weighed about 200 pounds. They couldn't carry that as effectively as they wanted to without blowing out their shoulder. So they got this gimbal stabilizer vest that their company paid for, and what this did was it removed the weight of the camera, it supplemented it onto these iron bars that they had around their head, and from there they could literally just stop and let the camera dangle in front of them, and they could grab it at any time. But what was nice was that it took the weight off of their shoulders. There's maybe about 40 pounds on their back at this point instead of 200 pounds on their shoulder. And from there, they're able to move around nice and smoothly without tipping over, falling over, and without the fear of the camera itself falling or breaking. Okay, will you need one? Probably not, but it is an option that's out there. And the last thing I'll talk about before we do questions for the remainder of class is setting a gimbal. So when you're using a gimbal with various configurations of both camera bodies and lenses, even if you're not, you're going to need to stabilize the gimbal every single time. And the three main functions that you'll have to configure are the pan, the tilt, and the roll. Almost every gimbal that's out there will have an app that you can download onto your device, onto your phone, that will explain and walk you through how that setup works without you having to necessarily just memorize everything right off the bat. It's very simple once you get to know it, but when you're first starting with it, it does take a little bit of extra help to kind of get going with that. And then the last thing too is to use fluid motions and practice out prior. When I get people who buy gimbals and they're starting to use them for the first time, I notice that they're really rocky with it and they're fast. And while yes, the gimbal is going to help to diminish that, it also comes down to you being able to go and swing in one fluid motion, keeping your body still. I have a few friends that do car videos for people who get their car done and get different paint jobs or things done to it. And so they'll literally just take videos where they walk around the car and they just film all the little edges and everything else. And what they do is they practice it out prior to shooting. They practice the motion that they're going to be doing. It's very similar to like just practicing free throws or throwing a ball around for a bunch. It's that muscle memory that starts to go into effect as you keep doing it over and over and over again. So make sure you calibrate or configure your gimbal every single time you use it. Use fluid motions and make sure you practice it all out before you start shooting. And then from there, that is all I have for this class. So next week will be Beyond the Traditional Camera. Actually, not next week because it'll be Thanksgiving. So 2 weeks from now, when we do our last class of the month, that's going to be our Beyond the Traditional Camera. We're going to talk about things like drones, GoPros, 360 cameras, and camcorders. Anything that's not a traditional mirrorless or a DSLR, your next step in your photography or videography process. As always, anybody who's watching online, I know I've got a few of you guys. If you want to ask any questions, just chat away. I'll answer them live on the screen. If anybody in class then has questions, I'm going to answer those first. So, okay.
Can you go back to the slide about the editing?
Yeah, which one?
Like you mentioned, there are two of them that you don't have to pay monthly for.
Yes, those are. Corel Capture One Pro and then Corel Paint Shop Pro.
Which one do you recommend?
I've had good success with Capture One Pro. I got to play with it on someone else's computer, and I really like the layout for it. It's easy, it's simple. I think you pay about $250, $300 for it the one time, and then you have it for the rest of your life. So I like the Capture One Pro out of the bunch.
Did you get a picture? Okay, good. Okay.
Why do lav mics sound so great? I would say the reason lav mics sound so great is because they're so close to the person that is being recorded, if you will. It's one of the only microphones that when you have it, it's going to be the closest to the person. Even if you're using something like a shotgun or a boom mic, the boom mic is going to be over their head. When we talk outward. And so when we're doing that, the one thing that'll pick up really well is a shotgun microphone, because that's pointed at the person. It's a cardio type microphone, so basically when it comes out, it's coming out, you're looking at the camera, it's coming out kind of like that direction, right? So a lav mic on the opposite end is the same type of microphone, just smaller, and it's pointed up towards our mouths as we're speaking. So lav mics are going to sound great because they're so much closer to us than any of the other microphones that they have. That's why when you get into a big filming studio, things like ESPN, the news, even if you watch like something like Friends, for example, those guys have microphones on them, but then they also have microphones above them too. So they're capturing audio from all sorts of things, so that way you get the most perfect audio. But yes, lav mics do sound great. What other questions do you have? Well, thank you.
I'm glad I came.
Yeah, we do it every Thursday, and I try to do, again, like I said, the same content every Thursday. What always changes are the people who come in and ask different questions and kind of poke my brain on different stuff. I don't always have the answers, but I have ways of finding them out.
Now you mentioned the next class is going to be to this year, but that could be the first week of December then?
No, technically there are, just to show, let's see, there are 5 Thursdays this month, so it'll be November 30th is the last class.
Okay.
If it was in that case, then I probably would have taught my class on like the 21st or the 20th, just to make sure that I teach and I keep my consistent schedule. But yeah.
Okay. 5 this month.
5 Thursdays this month. Anything else I can answer for you guys?
Just have you go over my camera a little bit more.
Which ones do you have?
But,
Does your camera still do that thing where it goes black for?
you know what? I figured it out. That's when you have it unlocked and you're trying to look at your picture.
Oh, right.
You know, but I'm still kind of concerned because I like using the auto thing, but you're saying not to use the pre-programmed stuff.
I
Especially
recommend-
this one compared to that, 'cause it's not on the wheel.
Yeah, I recommend not using scenes on the camera. I mean, they have them there, so again, they make it so that way you can take photos that are geared towards a landscape, a portrait, and what have you. But sometimes the camera doesn't think as smart as we want it to. So if it's struggling and you're not getting the image that you want, it's probably because you're past that setting, or that there is just something that we're missing on there. So my recommendation is either for beginning, automatic to green, which will limit you with what it can do. Program auto is still automatic, but now you can change certain things like your focusing and exactly what we were looking at.
Okay. You ever give a class on manual?
I don't. No, well, technically we do. That's the intermediate class where we talk about things like the f-stop, shutter, and ISO, how they're all different and how they all come
The
together.
second one, right?
That's the second one, yes.
Yeah, that's the one yeah.
Yeah.
That's
I'm
the one.
convinced we're gonna be watching that one over and over again.
So do you think this is a better camera than that one?
100%.
Yeah, is it better picture? Because sometimes they just seem to be coming out blurry, but I was trying to use that landscape
It could
thing.
be that. I mean, it also just could be a brand new camera. It sometimes takes a little bit to get used to how it works. But yes, for all intents and purposes, the mirrorless has more autofocus points. It's better for low light situations. It's a faster image. It's a crisper image. The only thing that a DSLR at this point does that a mirrorless doesn't is it has the optical viewfinder, where even if you don't have the camera turned on, you can look through the viewfinder, there's a mirror bouncing the light through, and you can see everything. But this is a digital viewfinder, and that was the biggest complaint when these first came out. Most photographers sat there and they were like, it's not true to life, it's not natural. But the camera brands like Canon, Sony, Nikon, they really worked on it so that way it's within like 0.0001 second that you're seeing the image as it comes through, hits the sensor, and then comes into the screen or the viewfinder. So, for all intents and purposes, yes, mirrorless is better than
Okay, I just can't so
DSLR.
much to it then.
It'll take some
Load
time.
the camera. and
I
everything.
think the big thing for you, and especially with the focusing problems that you're having,
Yeah.
is once you've got this guy on,
Mm-hmm.
I would click on the Q button and then play with your autofocus area.
Yeah, and that's what, I mean, I was doing that, and I was just kind of concerned, like this one, I thought I was just gonna do that little dots and those.
It would feel that way. The thing with doing a wide area is, again, it's going to do everything that it sees, but the second that it sees something is closer to you in the foreground, that's where it's going to automatically lock onto that. So if I start shooting this guy right here, it's going to start focusing on there, but if I use the screen here,
And then change the
yeah,
focus.
I can show you through this. So if I start pointing right there, there we go. That do it, yeah. So if I point towards that guy and start focusing with that's because I'm still on manual focus as I got one. That's cool. So now we do the playback on this guy. If we start to look through, things should look a lot more crisp through the whole image, not just that center point, but even the areas below and everything else. Because that area is not only focusing right there, but it's locking onto other points that it sees. If we wanted to just focus on that little tree itself, we could then change this setting to 1 point, focus in on that little tree.
So you want it on a higher point.
Exactly. So you have multiple options that you can do on there. The other thing too to be looking at with this is how your aperture is going. Right now you're using the automatic, so it's not necessarily going to change the f-stop for you without you changing it. So what we can do is if we go to aperture priority mode, we can then change the physical aperture on the lens. Focuser, so it's not this dial over here. So this guy goes all the way to f4. F4 is going to slowly start to blur out the background for us. So if I were to then focus on something like this, the wood grain is a little tough to see on there. But if we start zooming in on the wood grain, it should look a little bit more blurry. But when we look at our main object, it's going to look really crisp on there.
Okay.
So that's another way that we can look at this.
What setting do you have it on with?
The AV. Aperture priority, which is what we'll talk about during the intermediate class more about, because when we talk about manual control, we also talk about using AV and TV. TV being shutter speed, AV being your aperture priority. When you talked about doing long exposure, TV is going to be the best place to do that, because that's where you can really get the flowing or freezing kind of movement, that bulb setting.
I mastered it on that one, I gotta master it on this one yet.
It takes some time, They have the bulb on there, which is that continuous, where the shutter, continuous while shutter button is being pressed. That's what I think you're looking for on there. Where with this model,
I don't think I have that one, I don't remember Bob on there.
yeah, no, they don't have the bulb on there. What they have instead with that one is where you can do long exposure through the shutter priority and change that, which is probably what you were doing.
Something about 7. I remember us being the 7 and that one being the 8.
Oh, no, I know what you mean now, yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay. Thank you so
what other
much.
questions?
Very helpful. But I will be back.
Yeah, of course.
Definitely.
And then by all means, if you want to take a picture of this, what I always recommend too is if something doesn't look right while you're shooting, email me. Send me the photo. Tell me what you did while you were taking that photo and what you're trying to get done, and I can usually get you an answer. If not, I can send you videos. One of the first things I talk about in the intro class is that if I don't have the answer, the most amazing part about the cameras is that there are hundreds of people online who love talking about cameras, and they will literally talk for an hour and a half just on the model that you have. There's a few different people on there who do detailed breakdowns of either how the camera functions, what you can do to make your camera function better, or what I personally like is once you've mastered it and you've learned a lot about your camera, 10 things you didn't know about XYZ camera. So I do that all the time, even for my own camera. I shoot on a Sony, it's a 7R Mark V, and every once in a while I run into a problem where I'm like, I mean, I've done this for years, I know what I'm doing, but what am I missing? And so I'll type in, low light exposure, metering on the 7R Mark V, and I'll always find a video where someone for 20 minutes, 30 minutes will talk my ear off on just that camera.
I have a lot to learn. Yeah.
It takes time. You got an amazing camera. I don't think anything is wrong with the camera that you got. I think it just kind of comes down to learning and making sure you fine tune everything. So
I love the wide lens. When you compare pictures, I love it, That I do like.
Between the wide lens and the fact that, you bought the top of the line just with that little red line. Anytime you get a lens, if it's got the red line on there, you know that it's Canon's #1 glass.
Okay.
So that's a really powerful lens with a great
Now,
camera.
what difference between this and the nifty 50-50 besides the weight?
The weight, it's also going to come down to that it's a prime lens. So that's a telephoto lens. A telephoto lens basically means that we have a lens that we can zoom.
Yeah, 50-50 just
50 is just going to be on the 50. But where a nifty 50 is going to be different is the fact that a nifty 50 will have a lower aperture number. So right now your lens right now goes to 4. That's the lowest it can go. If I want from there, I can change the number with this dial on the top, and it's that number right there. I can change it as high as I want. The higher the number, the more in focus my entire image is going to be. The lower the number, the more I'm focusing in on my subject matter and I'm blurring out my background. So aperture really deals with your foreground to background relationship. As you then change it, and sometimes you can kind of see it on a prime lens, you can see it because that ring is going to be closer to the front there. You can see it's like your eyeball.
Okay.
When you're in the sun, your eye gets really, really small, the little iris part, the black dot, and when you're in darkness, it gets really, really big because it's trying to let the most amount of light in. This does the same thing, but it does it in the relationship to background and foreground. Do we need to see the background in full detail? Do we need to blur that out and just focus on our subject matter in front of us?
that might be a portrait.
Exactly. So that's what you're getting when you look at something like this, where it shows that form.
That seemed like the problem I was having when I was using that landscape thing.
Mhm.
If I had her in the picture, focusing on her and in the background, I was like, that's not supposed to be landscape.
Exactly.
That's
No.
why I was thinking something wrong with the camera.
That's the hard part with the camera as a whole, with those modes, because the modes, that's what they're designed to do. As soon as they pick up on an object or a person, they automatically want to focus in on that person. And then the automatic settings, they're going to take whatever lens you have and start to blur that background out. So because you have such a high-powered lens, it's going to start to blur that background out. So that, I would say, is just error based on the usage of the camera. But that's an easy fix on there.
Okay.
Now, a nifty 50 or a prime lens is really nice because if you want to do that with the blurring of the background, you can get something that has a 1.4 or a 1.2 aperture, which would literally make the background look like mush, and it would just be a perfect image of the person that you're trying to do. So portraits would be great for that. Some landscape would be really good for that. I'll have to put on my computer. I was in London for my vacation at the beginning of October, and I brought my Sony, and I only brought a 50mm lens with me, but I was able to get a majority of every photo I wanted to. Wide angle or landscape was a little bit tough, but as far as everything else goes, I was able to bounce back and forth between doing that, where I either blurred everything out, just focused on one thing, or kept everything in the frame and got a really crisp image. So
So can you get everything in frame in this and get
Yeah.
it crisp?
Yeah, I mean you can, absolutely.
Okay.
And that's going to be with what I was showing you with that wide angle setting on there, and then just making sure that, again, if you do have someone who's walking in the frame, they're not the main focus of that. So that also could be the menu button. Subject to detect. No, you don't have any of that. One thing you can do is if you're really trying to focus in on landscapes, in the menu setting here, so you've got subject detection off. So camera shouldn't, if it sees anybody, it shouldn't start focusing on them. But eye detection is on auto. So if a person's walking, it will focus in on the eye. Because if you can focus in on the eye itself, then the whole body should be perfect.
Okay,
That makes sense.
yes.
So in this case, you have it to auto. If you just click on it, you can change it to disable while maybe you're shooting landscape. That might help a little bit more.
Yeah, that it won't look for a person.
Exactly. Then it will, at least won't look for an eye.
Okay.
From there, let's see, what else do we have? Tracking sensitivity.
I mean, I know I might have it set now to focus on person,
Mm-hmm.
because, but I was trying earlier on off.
Yeah, right now you don't have anything on for that one. So
Okay.
that, and I'm gonna leave it the same way that you had it before, but that also could be something that you wanna look at too. As far as
Is what you do for a living, photography?
not necessarily. So my degree is in fine arts. It just happened so that I started working here. My grandfather's worked in the store for about 40 years now. So I started working here because of him, and they were like, "Oh, you're good with the cameras. You're good with art. You want to teach the class?" Sure, I'll teach the classes.
Your grandfather still works here?
Yes, he does. He's an appliance salesman.
See, I bought all my appliances here. I love this store.
We do our best. We do. Yeah, that looks really nice. Yeah, I would stick with that expandable area. I know the wide area seemed like the way to go, but just even now, taking with the expanded area, if I zoom in and I look at something like my laptop there, that looks pretty crisp. And then when I start to just go through and look at things down below through the glass,
Yeah.
that looks a lot better too.
Instead of full then, huh?
Yeah.
Okay. See, I thought full would be better. But it seems like that one.
The full one is going to still pick up on background and foreground stuff on there, so it gets a little bit tough. So that's where I was running into the issues, where I was just focusing in, and then all of a sudden, if I was here, it would take the whole entirety of my image and then start focusing in on my computer, because that was in the foreground, not in the background.
Okay. Okay. You've been very, very helpful.
Oh, of course, anytime.
Thank you.
Well, keep me posted on everything. Hopefully I see you next class with it. I know next class is going to be the beyond the traditional one, so
I think that one. I think the one after that for sure.
Absolutely.
And then the one after that.
I'll
Sorry,
be
stick to what instead of full?
stick to it is, one more time so I can see, I believe it is autofocus area. Around. Autofocus area around. Of course. And it doesn't look like anybody online has any more questions, so I'm going to sign off from here. Thanks everybody for coming into class today. I appreciate that, and I will see everybody